Parliament's off this week. MPs are getting ready for the party conference season. But don't worry, if the politicians aren't here in Westminster, we'll go to them, wherever they are. We've followed the lead of the opposition to a leftish love-in in Montreal, with people smuggling high on the agenda. Is there still light at the end of the tunnel for HS2? We check in on a project that might be running out of steam and running out of cash. And after a biblical flood, we're on the ground with the desperate people of Libya. Keir Starmer joins us from Canada, where he's puzzling out if the left has an answer to the global migration crisis. James Cleverly, the Foreign Secretary, just back from Beijing on China and climate change. And Love Actually director Richard Curtis on his inspirational halftime talk for the United Nations. And anchored here in the studio, three political insiders. The former Downing Street Director of Communications to Boris Johnson, that's Gudu Harris, broadcaster Daisy McAndrew, and the broadcaster and former advisor to Labour and Ed Miliband, Aisha Hazarika. Good morning and welcome to Sunday Morning with Trevor Phillips. Westminster's quiet, but don't let that fool you. To paraphrase the late Tony Benn, the politicians have left Parliament to spend more time with their politics. That probably means that they'll be knocking on your door pretty soon, canvassing your vote. The long election campaign has begun and nobody yet knows where it will end. The Conservative capacity for self-harm remains apparently undiminished, with fresh divisions over the triple lock on pensions and tax cuts. Yet many voters remain unconvinced by Labour, and in particular by its leader, Sir Keir Starmer. Poll watchers say that the electorate still can't work out who and what he is. We know he wants power, but we don't have any idea what he'd do with it. Yesterday, I spoke to him on the line from Montreal in an exclusive interview for this programme. You're in Canada for a gathering of centre-left leaders. I'm old enough to remember the ones with Blair, Schroeder, Clinton, the Australian Kevin Rudd, and now you've got Justin Trudeau and the former Finnish leader Sanna Marin, who works for Tony Blair now, and actually Tony Blair himself. Is this getting the third way band back together again?
What it's about is getting sort of progressive leaders across the world together, and that's prime ministers or those that are in opposition at the moment but hope to be in power before too long, to look at common challenges, global challenges. And the theme, we've been here since yesterday, the theme very much here is this sort of axis of insecurity about, global issues, Ukraine, of course, insecurity about economic issues, a big issue back at home in the UK, insecurity about climate, and insecurity about borders, which is something I've been talking about in the last few days, a particular issue in the UK, where I think there's a general sense in the public that the government has lost control of the borders, and that most basic of government features, which is the government ought to be the one that decides who comes to the country, has been lost by this government, and now it's the criminal gangs that are running the vile trade of putting people into small boats across the channel who are deciding who comes to the UK. And I've obviously set out my plans to tackle that, but here we're talking about those issues in a global way, talking about best practice, talking about the different ways we're handling that challenge, and it's a really good opportunity to have those discussions at this level.
Indeed. The polls suggest that you could be Prime Minister within a year, and indeed, like all progressive parties, centre-left parties across the world, you are faced with this particular issue, and it's been a problem for the left. Strikingly, in what you said this week about migration, you said that you would treat people smugglers as though they were terrorists. Let me test this out with you. Would you, for example, treat people smugglers the way we do terrorists and detain them without charge for 28 days?
What I meant by that is that we need to put people smugglers, those that are involved in this vile trade, in the same category as terrorists. And I went, obviously, to The Hague to discuss this with police units, Europol, those that do joint operations across a number of different countries. And what I know from my own experience, Trevor, I was obviously Director of Public Prosecutions between 2008 and 2013. I had staff in The Hague working on these joint operations. And when it came to counter-terrorism, what we were able to do very effectively was to share intelligence in real time, to agree between the lead countries where the investigation would take place, where we would smash the, in that case, terrorist gangs and bring them to justice. And I believe that if we put international organised immigration crime into that same bracket, we could run the same operation. I'll give you one small example. But we know that we know that the boats that are being used at the moment to cross the Channel are being effectively made to order. We know they're being stored in Europe and then brought to the north coast of France. It must be possible, if we get the right operation in place, to smash that operation. And that's what I was discussing when I was over there. And that's what I mean by putting them in the same category as terrorists.
Well, that's clear up to a point. But for 2 decades, one of the outstanding points about the way we deal with terrorism is that we have changed the law in relation to terrorism. And if I can just come back to you, would you, for example, treat people smugglers legally in the same way that we treat terrorists and detain them without charge for 28 days?
Look, I don't think it's the detention powers that are an issue here, Trevor. What I was talking about is the operation. There are other features of terrorist provisions that I would use. Just bear me out on this, because we've had serious crime prevention orders for a long time in place in relation to terrorism and other serious offending. And that allows a court to impose restrictions of movement, to chase money and freeze money of those involved in organised crime. Those orders have never been used to deal with those involved in the vile trade of putting people into the water to cross the Channel. And I want them to be used in that way. So this is very much, I'll go back to your previous question, this is very much the Labour Party saying there's a problem here. The government has only given us gimmicks. It's led to a huge problem, rhetoric and gimmicks, but no solutions.
Let's be clear.
What I'm focusing on is how we're going to actually deal with this.
I do want to be clear whether you mean what you say. Another possibility, which is in legislation, anti-terrorism legislation already, is that someone who knows that an act of people smuggling is about to take place would be subject to Section 38B. It requires them to report that to the police or face 5 years in jail, which would apply, if what you say is what you mean, to, for example, the families of children who come across on those boats, who know that they're going to arrive on those boats. Do you actually mean to treat them as terrorists or not?
Well, what I've said, Trevor, is that we need to put them in the bracket of terrorists, and that's what happened. That's why I want it to be used to smash those operations. I think that's very... I mean, I've seen for myself how those operations work in relation to terrorism very, very effectively. At the moment, we don't treat serious organised immigration offences in the same way. Now, a lot of this activity will be taking place in other countries, which is why I needed to go to some of those other countries to see if they're up for this sort of agreement. But frankly, we will never defeat this if all we get every time we suggest something is people saying, well, you can't do that, you can't do this. That is what's led to the problem. And we've got a situation now. I mean, I think what concerns people the most is that basic idea that the government ought to control who comes to this country has been lost under this government. And now it's these gangs that are deciding who should come to the United Kingdom. I'm determined to turn that around.
We get that, but what's clear is that whether or not we are controlling our own borders, we have to tackle this problem in concert with other governments. You've said that yourself. Now, you want to scrap the Rwanda plan that the government's put forward. Is it your belief that you can strike a deal with the EU over returning the illegal migrants who cross the Channel to the EU itself?
Well, let me frame the problem, which actually leads to that question. At the moment, what we've got is no control of the borders. So people are coming in, tens of thousands of people coming in across the Channel, and the government's rhetoric and gimmicks aren't stopping that. We've got then the gimmick of Rwanda, which has cost in the order of £140 million And the only person that's gone to Rwanda is the Home Secretary. So that isn't going to work. And we've got barges, which again, we've seen the fiasco over the summer. So we've got more and more people coming in.
Sorry to interrupt you, but we know that you think they are not working. I'm asking about your plan.
Yeah, so at the moment what we've got is this situation where there's a growing number of people who don't have their applications processed. That is unsustainable. It's costing £2 billion a year to keep them in hotels. That's not sustainable. So what we've set out, second point,
okay.
One, smash the gangs in the first place. Second point is process those claims. We set out how we will do that. Then of course, to get to your question, there is the question...
Let me just put this straightforwardly to you. You think that you can strike a deal with the EU. An EU diplomat told the Times this week there is absolutely no question of us helping the UK until we've put our own house in order. Starmer is deluded if he thinks that European governments, who are under much more pressure on asylum and migration than Britain, are going to come to his rescue. They are not going to come to a deal. They have tried for the last 7 years to come to a deal within the EU. Why would you be more successful?
Well, Trevor, obviously, I and everybody else has to answer the question, which is, you stop them coming in the first place where you can by smashing the gangs. You process the claims because it's ridiculous to keep people in limbo at £2 billion a year to the taxpayer. And then the question comes, what do you do with those people whose claims fails, and how do you get them out of the country and return them as quickly as possible? The answer to that, and I'll directly take on your question, is first, you don't need a returns agreement to return people to their country of origin. And if you've got safe countries that they can be returned to, let's say Albania or India, then we can simply get on with that with a fast
come down 90% already.
That's an example of the sort of agreement that can be struck. More of those can be done around the world, so you don't need a formal returns agreement. I'm not going to pretend that a returns agreement with those third countries isn't helpful. Of course it is, and we would seek to strike them. There's then the secondary question, which is, could there somehow be a returns agreement into Europe? Let me be absolutely crystal clear about this, because the government has been pumping out complete garbage this week.
All right, let's not go back over how terrible the Tories are, because I want to get on to some other issues.
I do think... Well, let me just complete on this, because there is obviously an EU quota system for EU members. Well, it's obviously not an EU member, and we will not... No, we will not be part of that. We're not an EU member. This is why what the government's saying is being complete garbage.
All right.
And even that scheme within the EU is not working. I've been discussing that with EU leaders here. That scheme itself isn't really working very well. So the idea that we're going to join the EU scheme on quotas is complete nonsense. We're not an EU member, and that wasn't what I was talking about.
All right. I mean, we could talk forever, but you've given us some limited time, so I do want to get on to a couple of other issues. The other big issue you'll be talking about this weekend is climate change. Gary Smith of the GMB, a big Labour funding union, said this week that we are in danger of reaching net zero by, quote, decimating working-class communities because every household, whatever their income, funds the green levy. He's talking about it as a green poll tax. He's right, isn't he?
Well, look, I talk to Gary Smith all of the time, and what he's concerned about, understandably, is the impact that the transition that we need to make in relation to net zero will have on working people. And I share his concerns, but it doesn't mean that I back off from our commitment on net zero. This is where we need global leadership. It's one of the things we're talking about here in Montreal. And I am absolutely committed that an incoming government will get to clean power by 2030. That will lead to lower bills because renewables are much cheaper than fossil fuels. It will allow us to get energy. Well, Trevor, just hear me out. It will allow us to have security over energy, so Putin doesn't put his boot on our throat, which we've seen the impact of in the last year or so. It involves the next generation of jobs, but Gary Smith is right. That needs to be a fair transition so that those who are employed in oil and gas at the moment are assured that there will be, many, many years of oil and gas under existing licenses.
And how are you going to make sure that working-class people who can't afford electric cars and big new boilers are part of this process and aren't paying the price? That's his point.
by driving down the cost of energy. And there's nobody that quarrels with the idea that if you get to clean power and renewables, the price of energy goes down. And of course, we need to make sure there's not a disproportionate impact on working people. That's a challenge that we can rise to. And it's not straightforward, but I think the wrong response is to simply say, and therefore we'll give up on net zero, we'll give up on the challenge of climate change. That's the position the government's taken, which is throw up its hands, lose global leadership, and go backwards.
Quick one on this point. Have you forgiven Sadiq Khan for losing the Uxbridge by-election with his ULEZ charge yet?
Oh, look, I speak to Sadiq Khan all of the time. We had a very productive meeting just last week. We're working together. And again, there's a classic example here. I've got two children, as you know, aged 15 and 12. I don't give them dirty water to drink. I don't want them to breathe in dirty air. So we can't do nothing. But what I don't want is a scheme that disproportionately hits those working people who need to use their cars. I'm talking to Sadiq about that, but this is a grown-up, constructive way forward. But what I'm not going to do is what the government's doing, is simply saying, well, I'm going to go back on that commitment. I don't want dirty air breathed by anyone. We need to find a way to deal with that.
Let's just deal, if I may ask you just one question about the most important question, which is the economy. You've been very clear about your approach to the economy, fiscally responsible, it won't spend money we haven't got. You're going to raise money for specific spending with a windfall tax and all of that. Can you guarantee that you said there's not going to be any rise in income tax, there will be no wealth tax. Can you guarantee that the tax burden, which is scheduled to hit a peak of 37.7% of GDP in 27, won't be higher under a Labour government?
I want the tax burden to come down, particularly on working people. That's been our consistent position. But, Trevor, the difference with me is that I am absolutely laser-focused on growing our economy, because the problem we've had in the last 13 years...
Before you go on to growth, are you saying the tax burden will not come down?
No, I'm saying I want it to come down for working people. That's what I said. But I also am absolutely focused on growing the economy. If the economy in the last 13 years had grown at the same rate as the last Labour government, we'd have tens of billions of pounds to spend on our public services without raising a penny more in tax. And that's where I want that laser focus. And that's why I've said, if we are privileged enough to come into power and to serve, we will have a number of missions. The number one mission is getting the highest sustained growth in the G7 and doing it not just in London and the South East, but across the whole of the United Kingdom with a different model of partnership with our businesses.
If I may quickly interrupt you, viewers would not forgive me if I did not put this question to you. The Leader of the House of Commons, Penny Mordaunt, said of you this week, I'm going to play the grab.
I think the Labour leader is Beach Ken. Beach Ken stands for nothing, on shifting sands, in his flip-flops, staring out to sea, doing nothing constructive to stop small boats or grow the economy. And when we examine his weak record on union demands, on border control, on protecting the public and stopping small boats, we discover that, like Beach Ken, he has zero balls.
Now, I'm not going to invite you to prove anything on camera, but would you like to correct the anatomical record?
Look, I just think when a government has completely run out of energy and ideas and the ability to shape or change anything, they go down this rabbit hole of ridiculous insults. It's water off a duck's back to me. I'm clearly setting out, in strong terms, what I'd do about issues like border control, where in the past, Labour has not really wanted to speak. So I speak confidently about the challenges that we face. My focus, unlike Penny Mordaunt's, is on the challenges that we face as a country.
I will pass your message on to the Leader of the House of Commons, see what she makes of it. Keir Starmer, thank you very much indeed for your time.
Thank you.
That was the Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, so let's get some reaction from our panel. 3 political insiders, Two were political gamekeepers turned media poachers. Daisy McAndrew, former press secretary to Lib Dem leader Charles Kennedy, who became ITN's chief political correspondent. Aisha Hazarika, special advisor to the once upon a time Labour leader Ed Miliband, now at Times Radio. And Guto Hari, who made the reverse journey from the BBC before defecting to what probably looked like an establishment civil service job in Number 10, chief spin doctor to Boris Johnson. OK, obviously the biggest story of the morning is the Russell Brand allegations, and we're going to come to those later, if you don't mind. But for the moment, let's stick to the formal politics. Is any of you any wiser about what Labour would actually do to reduce the levels of illegal migration? Daisy, start with you.
Well, thanks for dumping me in it. I think I can probably speak for the panel and the audience to say not really, although I think it is impressive that they're trying to tackle this issue, because we know from all the polls at the moment that a significant majority of people are very unhappy about this issue. We could debate all morning about whether that's the right or wrong topic for politics to be centring on, but whether we like it or not, it is going to be a very big one. It's difficult to come up with a policy that's any clearer than stop the boats, which, of course, has been the Conservative motto for some time. And I think people will look at Keir Starmer and think he's not going to get anywhere with trying to negotiate with the EU, and a lot of EU politicians have been poo-pooing that idea. However, I think the fact that the Labour Party is really pushing Keir Starmer right to the centre, I found it fascinating looking at the party conference booklet that's just come out. There are 13 photographs of Keir Starmer. So they clearly think that he's more of a vote winner than he has been in the past, as being less popular than the party. But I'm not sure that this is the policy that's going to convince many people.
Are they going to be quaking in Number 10? Are they going to be worried? I mean,
I think we should take it seriously, because the trick the Labour have missed for a long time is to play to Keir Starmer's strengths. They talk about the economy. He is not remotely as qualified as Rishi Sunak is to tackle economic problems. Rishi, that's what he did for decades. He's an economist. But when it comes to talking tough on prosecuting criminals, he has form, he has credibility. So when he uses that kind of language, it works. But when you put the obvious questions to him, right, you're happy to use the word terrorist, but does that mean you'll detain them without trial? Oh, you can see him squirming. He hates the idea. Does that mean you will use the powers that you can to stop terrorism, to stop this? You can see he doesn't want to go there. So I think there's still a mismatch between an operation that has clearly changed gear and is purring away at the moment. It's a lot more impressive than it has been. And the core of the man who doesn't want to be the kind of person that they think he needs to be to win an election.
Is there a problem here, Aisha, that the soundbite's great, but actually once you dig below, it's a bit softer?
Well, I think what he's doing is setting out a series of proposals which is the most realistic on the table. It's not highly ideological. It's also not off to the wacky races in terms of the Rwanda scheme. Or let's not forget, at one point, Priti Patel was mooted to have suggested a giant wave machine in the... So we have been in the realm of sort of like ludicrous fantasy in terms of immigration, the small boats. Daisy is right, it is a big issue, particularly for a lot of those heartland voters that Labour wants to win back. But what I think is really interesting about this intervention is the intervention itself. Labour has been haunted by immigration by many years, infamously from Gordon Brown's own hot mic moment with Mrs Duffy, right through when then he tried to sort of capitulate and said, you know, British jobs for British workers, had a huge backlash. The problem for Labour is the right will castigate Labour as being soft, liberal, bleeding hearts who want open borders, invite everybody in. The left will criticise Keir Starmer now for being a sort of heartless right-wing thug in terms of this. So Labour's got to sort of... And I think the fact that they have come out on it shows a confidence that there are no no-go areas. Look, a lot of this plan, the devil's going to be in the detail, and the reality will happen if Labour wins. But I think we all have to be really honest. Whoever is in power, look, we have an absolute kind of shambles right now, but the problem of mass migration is not going away. We've got climate change, we've got conflict, we've got these natural disasters we've just seen in Morocco, Libya. These are very difficult issues. But cooperation is... We just look at Albania. The fact that the government has actually had a good relationship with Albania, that has actually yielded some results. So there's a lot to be said for better international cooperation and not slagging off the French the whole time.
It's first worth looking at facts. You know, we kind of like facts on this show. Let's look at the small boats numbers. I wanted to show you this graph. Here's what's happened in the last 4 years. And particularly look at the top two lines, 2022 and 2023. Actually, almost nothing has changed this. Do you think anybody's actually got a solution to this yet?
It would be really refreshing for me if people said, what is the cause of this in the first place? The cause in the first place is poverty and deprivation in Africa. And I was in the room when the G7 decided that they wanted a Belt and Road initiative to create jobs and opportunities for young people in Africa.
That's basically a sort of Marshall Plan, money to the third world in the way that Chinese are doing it now.
Not a penny has been committed, not a scheme has been approved, nothing is happening there to deal with the root causes of it. And so they get to Lampedusa, and I've been to Lampedusa, you get to Lampedusa, you get to London in the old days. Now we're out to the EU. The theory was that you get to Lampedusa and you can get right up to the northern coast of France, but it stops there. Clearly it doesn't. If the willpower is there, I have to say, without being anti-French, but if the willpower is there, they could stop people leaving their shores. If you and I tried to jump in a dinghy and get over to France, with some, dodgy goods or whatever, they would find us, so they could find these people.
But I think it's a bit unfair to say that they're not doing anything, because actually, since the newish deal was put in place, the French are stopping more boats than they had before. And also, I really like your graph, Trevor, but actually, it doesn't matter what the truth is if the impression that the British public have is that more and more and more people are coming. It's a political problem, even if the facts and the figures don't bear that out. And I think the fact that Keir Starmer is going to be meeting Macron is very interesting on this issue. It's very rare for a foreign leader to want to meet a leader of the opposition. So that's quite a big deal for Keir Starmer.
I think we have to be really honest about the situation with France and other countries. We have to understand that we have a geographical advantage that other landlocked countries don't have. You've made a very good argument about the travel from, poverty-stricken parts of Africa to get... Once you're sort of on mainland Europe, you can travel around, and that's something that other EU countries, landlocked countries, have had to deal with. We've been insulated from that situation because we are an island and we're the sort of furthest most point. Now, this is starting to come to our shores now because the sheer scale of mass migration, and it is not going to go down, as I said earlier. And in terms of the French, the Germans, other people, why should they go out of the way to help us, particularly when we've had a very hostile relationship? I'm trying to say the last Prime Minister, it's hard to keep up. Liz Truss couldn't even answer friend or foe when asked about
stopping poor people being exploited and pushed into dinghies that are likely to sink. That's why they should help.
But
just before you go, is there any chance, do any of you think, that he could actually strike a deal with the EU?
I think he could strike more of a deal than his Conservative predecessors, just because there will be, I think, a willingness to think perhaps this is a new, fresh blood and a new chance. OK,
one last thing. I did play the Penny Mordaunt comments to him. As former spinners, he must have been expecting that at some point. How do you think he dealt with it?
Not bad. I mean, I would have said more or less the same thing. I don't take the bait, but maybe just to acknowledge a little bit of humour, I'd have said it in a very deep voice.
Yeah, I think the humour angle... a funnier politician would have had a funnier answer, and we do like a bit of a light touch from our politicians, so he needs to work on his gags. Is
that the part of the problem for Keir, Aisha, that he's a very serious guy? I mean, he's top man, but in intellectually and all that. But is there a problem here?
As Guta knows, we had, clown extraordinaire running the country. Didn't go so well. I mean, look, I think that answer could have had a lightness touch. If I was Keir Starmer's press team, I would have said, listen, if you're happy to compare me to Ryan Gosling and those abs, I'm happy to take it.
All right, OK. More later. It is just coming up to 9 o'clock. You're watching Sunday Morning with Trevor Phillips. In the last hour, the Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, has exclusively told this programme that any suggestion that the Labour government will join the EU's asylum system is complete garbage, as he dismissed Penny Mordaunt's jibe, comparing him to a Ken doll as water off a duck's back. Well, there's still plenty to come, of course. In just a moment, we'll hear from the Foreign Secretary, James Cleverly. And as world leaders prepare for this year's UN summit, the iconic screenwriter Richard Curtis tells us why meeting key sustainability goals remains a tall order, and whether our current crop of politicians is up to the task. Now, last week, Morocco braved its strongest earthquake in half a century. Thousands were killed and aftershocks continue. This week it was Libya's turn to suffer. Biblical floods have devastated the city of Derna, and at least 11,000 are dead. Sky News was the first UK broadcaster on the ground in Libya. Before I spoke to the Foreign Secretary, James Cleverly, a short time ago, I got an update from our special correspondent, Alex Crawford, who is in Derna.
It is a week on since this massive disaster, and the picture is still utterly, utterly grim. In fact, to be honest, there isn't really enough words, big enough words, strong enough words in the English language or indeed the Arabic language to describe just how bad it is down there. And we're talking about 7 days on from it. I mean, whole families have been wiped out. Whole blocks of flats have been lifted up off their foundations and disappeared. Over the last few days, hundreds of bodies are still being picked up off the coastline just outside Derna. We saw a number of them ourselves. There is now a real problem of disease spreading. We were with overnight crews, rescue crews of soldiers, volunteers, aid workers, doctors who were digging with their hands. They brought in a digger at one stage, but there are only about 5 of them in the whole of this area, the whole of the city, because they had heard a child's voice underneath all this rubble. This child had apparently been able to make a phone call about a day ago. Now, this is a week on, so the situation is still absolutely awful.
Alex, stay with us for a moment, if you will. I have with me the Foreign Secretary, James Cleverly. What's your response to what Alex is saying, and particularly our efforts in getting help there?
Well, Alex has, I think, highlighted a number of key challenges and perhaps differences between the situation that we see in Libya and in others, in Morocco and in Turkey. In both those other examples, Morocco and Turkey, we had effective governments which had control over the geographical area of the tragedies in question. It is a very different situation in Libya. The UK has donated an initial £1 million, and we have allocated 10 million to be part of a wider international response. We've deployed an emergency medical team, and we will coordinate with other countries. Indeed, when I was in Ankara in Turkey, just at the tail end of last week, I was speaking with the Turkish foreign minister and defence minister about what more we could do as an international coalition to support them. But the governance situation in Libya makes it incredibly difficult, which is why...
A divided country, essentially.
It is a divided country, and as Alex was saying, in other places, the international effort can move more quickly. The civil war has, in many ways, broken the infrastructure that you would normally wish to deploy in a terrible, terrible situation like this.
Alex, just lastly to you, is that a picture that you recognise? From where you're standing, what advice would you have for the Foreign Secretary?
I'm not sure I'm the right person to give advice to James Cleverly, but what I would say is that obviously it's a very complicated political situation, and both sides are trying to make capital of this. And certainly the Libyans feel that the British have more of a connection with the West rather than the East. They definitely don't feel that they're getting enough international support. They haven't specifically mentioned Britain, just it's all the international community. And they're worried that the international community is going to end up dealing with the West, which is the United Nations recognised government. Both governments, both authorities have got a very poor reputation amongst Libyans themselves. They're identified as being corrupt, greedy, self-serving, not really for the Libyan people. And they're worried that whatever aid comes in is going to be snatched by corrupt officials. And so they're very keen for some sort of international overarch on how any aid is distributed. The aid is it's a difficult country to get access to. It's a difficult country for journalists to get access to. So I imagine it's difficult for the aid officials. But they need help. And there's got to be some sort of way of getting round all this bureaucracy and tiptoeing through this minefield of politics, because the actual Libyan people are crying out for it.
Alex, thank you very much indeed. Stay safe. Foreign Secretary, It's obviously a big situation that's occupying a lot of your time. If you don't mind, I want to just deal with one other issue from that region. It's a year since the murder of Mahsa Amini by the Iranian authorities for apparently not wearing her headscarf in what they thought was the proper way. What are we actually doing to support the women of Iran?
Well, we have taken direct action in relation to the individuals and institutions that have been involved in oppressing women in Iran. So we have sanctioned the organisation which is legally persecuting or claiming legal authority to persecute this women.
The so-called morality police.
The morality police. We have sanctioned those. We have sanctioned elements of the judiciary who have clearly been abusing their authority. The point that I have made, and I've made it in ways that I believe get directly to the ears of the Iranian leadership, is that their actions are being rejected by the Iranian people. The Iranian people, sophisticated, well-educated, and in many instances very, very cosmopolitan, are saying very, very loudly that they reject the oppressive regime that's coming out of Tehran.
But these guys don't necessarily listen even to their own people. They might listen to us if we took stronger action. I understand the point about sanctions, but is there more that we ought to do? Because in some senses, time's running out. You know, thousands of these women have been imprisoned. We understand hundreds of people have been killed because of the protests. Are we really making a difference?
Well, we have to understand that with a regime like the one in Tehran, we don't have the traditional international and diplomatic levers that we might have with other governments. But we make it absolutely clear, both directly to the Iranian leadership and more broadly on the international stage, that we completely reject their oppression of women, that we will continue to take action to highlight that and also to apply sanctions to, as I say, both the entities and the individuals who are driving this.
All right, let's talk about the issue of when to engage and when not to engage and how you deal with recalcitrant states. You visited China just a couple of weeks ago, and days later we find that a researcher working in Parliament who is linked in various ways to senior Conservative MPs, was arrested in March, 6 months ago, on suspicion of spying for China. Did you know about that arrest before you visited Beijing?
Well, as you know, Trevor, we don't discuss intelligence matters. We do not discuss
No, but it's a simple, straightforward. As a parliamentarian, did you know?
As I say, we don't discuss intelligence or security matters. But the broad point...
But the guy was arrested. That's not an intelligence question. Everybody, presumably, would have known about that, including you.
Yeah, as I say, we don't discuss... the UK government, by long-standing convention, doesn't discuss intelligence or security matters. The point being that China is a country with which we have to engage. And one of the things that I think it's important people understand is that...
Before you go on that, I think viewers would be a bit puzzled that the arrest of somebody by the police, unless you're saying that somehow the intelligence services were involved in that arrest, the arrest of somebody by the police for potential criminal activity is an intelligence matter. I mean, everybody in the Metropolitan Police will know about this. It's not an intelligence matter, is it?
Well, what you're asking about...
I'm just asking if you knew the guy has been arrested.
So the point that I made is that because of the nature of the arrest, the charges on on the suspicions on which he was arrested. Of course, there are understandable questions. People are understandly curious about
sorry to press you on it. I'm not asking you to comment on the charges. I'm just simply asking, before you went to Beijing, did you know that this man had been arrested?
And as I said, because of the nature of what he was arrested for, I am not going to discuss what we knew when because that does drift into that area of work that we do not discuss.
Oh, either you knew or you didn't.
For the point, I'm not discussing it.
OK, so you're not going to tell me. All right. Let's just deal with something you must know about. Your party's blocked 2 prospective parliamentary candidates from standing after MI5 warned that they might be spying for China. Did you know about that before you went to China?
Again, Trevor, you keep asking me about intelligence and security issues, and I'm going to keep giving you the same answer.
But the point is, the intelligence people would have had to tell people who don't have clearance. And I'm simply asking if you knew.
So I'm a government minister, and you keep asking me about intelligence and security matters, which you're an experienced politician and an experienced broadcaster, and you know that I can't discuss and I won't discuss those areas.
All right.
The point is the fact of the matter is that our engagement with representative of foreign governments, whether that be in the UK or whether I go to their countries, is an important part of what I do and what the British government does. And it's important that we engage for a whole load of areas to avoid miscalculations and errors, to make sure that messages, particularly the most difficult messages, are communicated straight to the heart of those respective governments. And indeed, when I went to China, I absolutely made the point that the UK expects China to abide by its international obligations under things like the Vienna Convention of Diplomatic Relations, that the sanctioning of my parliamentary colleagues was completely unacceptable, as well as their behaviour in Hong Kong, in Xinjiang, and other areas as well.
All right, but let me not ask you the same question, but maybe ask it in a slightly different way. Knowing what you do now, do you regret that you made this visit at this time?
No, because there is work to do. There is incredibly important work to do. And the advocates are somehow ignoring China, pretending it doesn't exist, not talking to China, not having an embassy in Beijing and not having a Chinese embassy in the UK. And I know that's not your position, but some people have said that we should disengage from China. That is not a credible option. When there is a difficult relationship, and this is a challenging and difficult relationship, it is more important rather than less important that you maintain those face-to-face communications.
All right, well, look, I mean, let's follow your strategy. Engage, talk to them. When you talk to them about their spying activities, the range of Confucius Institutes, these organisations that they've set up across the world, some here, the suspicions that some of their students are spying on other Chinese students. What do they say when you say to them, we don't like this? Which presumably you must be saying to them.
Well, as I say, we have made it very, very clear. The Prime Minister did when he met the Deputy President most recently. I've had the same conversations with my Chinese counterparts, that we reject any country's interference, including China's, any country's interference in our democracy, that we expect China to abide by the Vienna Convention obligations that they have freely entered into. And those are the conversations we have. And we have them directly with the people that hold power in the Chinese system.
Just one very quick question on this as a parliamentarian. Alicia Kearns, chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, she gave this person parliamentary pass. Would it be wise for her to step back from that role?
Look, I think the idea that a government minister passes judgment on the...
I'm asking you as a parliamentarian.
Yeah, but you've got to remember the relationship. So it is the right authorities to look into this is the Speaker and the parliamentary authorities about the issuing of passes. I know Alicia is a highly principled and effective individual, and I think it would be wrong for me, as the minister who she scrutinises, to start commenting.
All right, let's talk about what still remains probably one of the biggest things on your plate right now, which is Ukraine. Nobody's going to doubt the government's sincerity in its support for Ukraine, but not a lot of point in sympathy if you're not actually helping. And former Prime Minister Boris Johnson had something to say about this in the last few days. He says, what the hell are we waiting for? There's only one thing they want from us, and that's weaponry. don't understand why we're dragging our feet, why are we so slow. Is Boris Johnson right that we are basically just being too slow while Ukrainians are dying?
Well, I don't know when he talks about we, who he's talking about.
He's talking about us, this country, our government.
No, he cannot be talking about the United Kingdom. Because,
that's what he says.
Because under his tenure, and I always pay tribute to his leadership on this, we supplied those NLAW anti-tank missile systems that were so instrumental in the defence of Kyiv. We supplied training. The UK was the first to commit to supply main battle tanks. And then after we committed to that, this during my time as Foreign Secretary under Rishi Sunak as Prime Minister, we were the first in the world to commit main battle tanks. Other countries in the world then followed our example. We were the first to commit to the training of fast jet pilots. Then other countries followed our example. We were the first to commit to... let me finish, because you put a very, very serious point up, and I think it's important that people understand. We were the first to commit to those long-range missiles that have been instrumental in helping the Ukrainians in their battle in the south and the southeast of Ukraine. So we have led the world on all these issues. And when I go to the United Nations tonight, I will continue to advocate for the ongoing international support for Ukraine and its self-defence.
I understand all of that, but the list you've just given us, most of it happened under Boris Johnson.
No, not at all.
Well, let me finish my question.
Main battle tanks.
Let me finish my question, if I may.
Sunak. Air combat training under Rishi Sunak.
Let me finish.
Long-range missiles under Rishi Sunak.
Let me finish my question.
Go on.
Boris Johnson, acknowledged by the Ukrainians as the first and the most enthusiastic supporter, that's why Zelensky came here first, surely he should know about the issue of pace, since he was the fastest of Western leaders to respond. And he now says that the momentum that he set is essentially being run into the ground by you guys. I mean, honestly, you've got to take this seriously.
So, of course, I take his comments seriously, but I've just given you evidence that he's wrong on this issue, because we continue to take the lead on the battle-winning equipments that the Ukrainians have specifically asked for. Fast air, combat jet aircraft. Sorry, fast air is in-house terminology.
That's something different.
Combat jet aircraft. And the training of those pilots, the training of Ukrainian Marines, the provision of main battle tanks, the provision of depth fires. If you ask the Ukrainians, and I speak unsurprisingly to the Ukrainians very regularly on this, they remain incredibly grateful, not just our donations, but our leadership on this issue.
OK, I'm stopping you because there are a couple of other things I need to talk to you about. Domestic policies. There's been a lot of talk this week about the issue of cuts of benefits and so on. I don't want to get into that generally, but I want to ask you about a specific thing. It's said that the Prime Minister and the Chancellor are considering more cuts to the high-speed rail line to the north, stopping it short of Manchester, for example, not letting it come into London. Will you be OK with that?
Well, you're asking me what my position would be on speculation about what the government position would be. The fact of the matter is there are spades in the ground. The HS2 is in the process of being built. It is transformational. When I've been up to see the fantastic work that Andy Street is doing in the West Midlands, much of that is dependent on the economic input that HS2 will have in that region. It's an important piece of infrastructure. The Prime Minister is absolutely committed to levelling up. This is part of that levelling up.
So it needs to keep going to Manchester?
Well, as I say, foreign affairs is my area of speciality.
Yeah, but you're an MP.
So, but the sequencing, we've always got to make sure that the sequencing is right. What leaders in devolved government want, what investors in the UK want, is predictability, and therefore we will make sure that they know exactly what's going on.
Last point. I can't really not ask you about the Russell Brand issue. And you can't say anything about specific allegations, but there are a lot of these things coming out of the world of entertainment and politics. One of the by-elections you're going to face this autumn is because of the conduct of an MP. What is it about your world that makes these things happen?
So look, I don't think it is unique to the world of politics. I mean, sadly, we see behaviour like this quite widespread. I do, however, think there is a particular problem where you have environments where there are very, very sharp differentials in power. We see that. I mean, we see that in the film industry, the entertainment industry, and sadly, of course, we see it in the area that I work in terms of politics, where you have very, very significant power differentials, long working hours, people in that environment. Now, that is absolutely no excuse for individual misconduct, and people have to take responsibility for their own conduct. But in those environments, I think institutionally, we need to be particularly vigilant. We need to make sure that we are going out of our way to protect the people that have less power than those around them. And we need to respond to their concerns very, very quickly when they are highlighted.
Foreign Secretary, thank you very much for your time this morning.
Cheers, Trevor.
That was the Foreign Secretary, James Cleverly. Coming up in just a few minutes, we'll find out what our panel made of what he had to say. I'll be joined again by them to mull it all over.
They've pushed the protesters further back here. There's around 200 or 300 still remaining.
I'm Dan Whitehead and I'm Sky News' West of England correspondent.
This van goes onto the streets of Plymouth 7 days a week, 365 days a year.
These facilities at the moment are a lifesaver. It's all we've got.
From fishing communities to bustling cities, we spend every day reporting from across the region, hearing from people who have real stories.
I'm gonna have nowhere to live for about 3 or 4 months.
There are still people inside the properties here.
They're coming from the epicentre of what is now a global health pandemic. We were seeing and speaking to young women who were selling themselves right on the high street. It was desperately sad, and the fact it was happening right in the heart of this community.
Before Brexit, these oysters were being exported to the EU, but the trade stopped overnight.
What's your feeling about the future then?
Blake might all be finished, I don't know.
Welcome back. This is Sunday Morning with Trevor Phillips. Let's go back to our panel. Boris Johnson's Communications Director, Guto Harry, former Labour advisor Aisha Hazarika, and journalist and broadcaster Daisy McAndrew. Guto, of the four of us, you probably have the highest security clearance.
Had.
Did you buy this thing that this arrest of the man in March was a security thing about which he could not speak?
I do. And I know it's frustrating for you to keep asking him, but any briefing he would have been given would have started with that, but within a nanosecond would have gone into how they knew, what the allegations were, what the sources that it would get into territory where if he mentioned any of it, he'd be in deep, deep trouble. And so frustrating though it is, I think you've got to give him a pass on that one. He was very wise not to go there. He also, I think, was trying to say that's neither here nor there, because there's a lot more to China than whether some junior researcher in the House of Commons is trying to pass stuff on, something he denies, incidentally. But China is a massive
You can't dismiss it just like that.
Power. Well, it's more interesting that we have this massive power that's a massive tech player in the world now, and through that technology will become even more powerful and have leverage over lots of us. It's diplomatically all over Africa and parts of the world where we are very, very slow. So we have to deal with China. The reality is we don't have to be best friends, but we have to be a bit more constructive than the government has been for a while. And I think he's a real breath of fresh air.
But you can see why the issue of a researcher who may or may not be a Chinese spy working in the Houses of Parliament is a real issue and has concentrated minds amongst you. I've spoken to a lot of MPs who are really upset about the fact that this happened back in March, because these are MPs who, as he said, as cleverly said, have sanctions on their own name, are sort of marked by the Chinese because they are very hawkish on the Chinese. And a lot of them are talking to dissidents who have bounties on their heads or who the Chinese are actively looking for. And now, through the fact of this researcher allegedly giving out secrets, those dissidents are now in more danger than they were before. So you can see that it has concentrated minds and made people very anxious.
It's very serious. It's very serious, but he cannot go there. He cannot go there at all.
No,
because he will know a whole load of things that, when his lips are moving, should not be coming out of his mouth.
But I think it's very wrong to dismiss it. I mean, the security services themselves are saying that this is actually the most serious breach of security in Parliament in sort of modern British political history.
What happened to innocence until proven guilty? I will believe that when the guy has actually...
Let Aish finish her point.
Say that without saying this guy is actually guilty of something really treacherous.
This is what people from the security service are saying. And I think the problem that the government has... And look, there is a big problem about how you handle China. But I think part of the problem is sometimes the rhetoric sounds really tough on sort of hostile foreign agents, and that's not matched up with what happens on the ground. I mean, the Conservative Party talks very tough, rightly, on Russia now, but let's not forget the very cosy relationship that the government had with a lot of Russian money when it suited them. The issue with China is very hard, though. On the one hand, the government says you've got to put the security stuff first. They're a hostile agent. They're a thoroughly bad thing. On the other hand, the business secretary will be under a lot of pressure from British businesses who say, look, there ain't a lot of money in the UK right now. We want to get some juicy big business deals with Chinese firms. There is money in China. We need that inward investment into this country. So it's a difficult balance.
Good. I wondered about not so much about the principle of going to China. I think pretty much everybody's in the same place here. But timing. Not a great look in this situation for him to have gone to Beijing.
Do you know what? It's not a great look. One of the things that China reminds us of is while they are planning 20, 30, 40 years ahead, building stuff, commissioning stuff, studying how our system works, replicating it, outmanoeuvring us, there's always something short-term here that we think trumps thinking long-term. And that's why we can't build infrastructure. That's why we can't see beyond next week. That's why maybe we've had 5 prime ministers in 6 years. We've got to start thinking a little bit more long-term and get back to things that traditionally were our great strengths, that if we have allegations against people, we put them on trial. And only when that trial is over do we start bandying things about them being massively treacherous.
Because the Tory party does that all the time. Yeah. The Tory party never attacks
This is not
people.
a partisan point.
Daisy.
It's politics.
I completely take your point about the short-termism and long-termism. It's much easier easier to be long-term if you don't have a healthy democracy, as is the case in China. You can make 20, 30-year plans.
Let's just talk about one of the other points I raised with him, and that is the situation of women in Iran. Aisha, are we doing enough?
I don't think we are. And, as a woman, as a feminist, it absolutely breaks my heart to see the unbelievable courage of these so many young women and the abuse that they face, the physical violence they face, the torture, some execution for the crime, the temerity of showing a strand of hair. I mean, it is horrendous. And I think, we talk a good game about standing up for the rights of women, and indeed that's become a very contentious topic over here. We want to talk about our values of equality. But I think for so many people, you look at what's happening to women in Iran, you look at what's happening to women in Afghanistan, and it is absolutely heartbreaking. I would like to see much more done on a diplomatic level. I'd like to see more of our politicians talking about this more.
OK, got to pay the bills now. Coming up after the break, one of the great screenwriters of our time, Richard Curtis, tells us who he'd cast as the Labour leader on film.
Keir Starmer was apparently the inspiration for Colin Firth's part as a human for Colin Firth's role in Bridget Jones. So I'm going to go for Colin, although I think he'll have to put on a little bit of weight.
five of us have made it out of the car.
welcome to Backstage, the film and TV podcast.
Welcome back. This is Sunday Morning with Trevor Phillips. It's arguably the most existential question of our times: how to make the world a fairer, healthier and more prosperous place. Well, there's a set of targets set down by the United Nations to do just that by 2030. The problem is that the government here reckons they're way off track. The Deputy Prime Minister is heading to New York to do an address to the United Nations General Assembly. And there's a new campaign to get world leaders to act.
We heal as a team, or we're going to crumble. Inch by inch, play by play, till we're finished. We're in hell right now. And we can stay here, or we can fight our way back into the light. We can climb out of hell. 1 inch at a time.
The campaign is the brainchild of the screenwriter and director Richard Curtis, once called Britain's King of Comedy, the man behind Love Actually, Blackadder and Mr. Bean. I started by asking him what it was about Al Pacino's speech that inspired him.
Do you know, I've always been obsessed by the speech. It's one of those things where, as it were, when I feel as though I need repassioning, I watch it. And in fact, it starts with him saying, "We are in hell now." And the UN Secretary General said, "We're on the highway to climate hell with our foot on the accelerator." So when we were trying to think of some way of inspiring people, you know, about what they can do and the situation it is and hope that they can have and determination to change paths, it leapt into my mind. And also, we're using this analogy of being halfway through the game of the Sustainable Development Goals because we are, you know, halfway to 2030. So it seemed like an excellent tool to use.
Well, the thing carries a punch. Does it worry at all, though, that some people might read it as this is just going to be too difficult? Actually, let's not bother.
I suppose I'd reply that by saying Liverpool, AC Milan, 3-0 down at half-time, and they win 4-3. I mean, the amazing thing about the world at the moment is there are so many powerful tools that could be being used that, and you know, there's massive investment in renewable energy, there's all the potential of AI, there are incredible medical breakthroughs with regard to maternal mortality and things like that. So in many cases, it's just a question of a determination, as it were, a new game plan, a determination to exploit those things that we could be doing instead of sitting and saying, well, it is difficult, we might as well give up at half-time.
This is being done for the United Nations. Some people are saying that the United Nations, worthwhile intent, but pretty poor execution. They can't even throw Russia off the Security Council, given what they've done. How can we have confidence that this is the organisation to lead this of the most extraordinarily important fight possibly in human history?
Well, the United Nations, you know, were the people who developed these goals, but all those goals were signed on to by 193 countries. So the truth of the matter is that responsibility, you know, lies with the UN to do the best work that it can. But what this film is trying to say is it's also every leader, every business leader, every teacher, and then every citizen.
On this team, we fight for that inch. We claw with our fingernails for that inch. Because we know when we add up all those inches, that's going to make the difference between winning and losing.
The last thing I'm saying is leave it to the UN, they'll deal with it. What this is saying is actually to everybody in the world, what are you going to do? What are you going to do to see whether or not we can turn so many things around?
But of course, it's not just the states or their leaders who matter here. In the end, actually, it's the people who have to change their behaviours, who have to buy new ways of heating and or cooling their homes. And there's a considerable degree of pushback, both here in the UK and also in the United States, and in fact, all over the developed world, that all of this is too expensive, too difficult for ordinary people.
Yeah, well, you know, that is, we are in a cost of living crisis. It's been really a very tough few years with conflict, with COVID. And the question is, you know, the SDGs were always intended to both apply to our own countries as well as countries abroad. But there are a lot of choices you can make that, as it were, don't have financial implications. Let's say the bank that you bank with. Now, some banks are pouring money into new fossil fuels. Don't bank with one of those banks. If you've got a pension, try and get a pension that is actually sustainable and is supporting things. You'll make just as much money on that pension. You know, there are clothes that you can buy, there's local food that you can buy. There are so many things that if we apply ourselves to them, it's not a sort of morals versus money issue. It's focusing on the way that you yourself can change the world, how you vote, all these things. So it's not saying it's a more expensive option. I've heard Mark Carney, who was governor of the Bank of England, describe sustainability as the biggest investment opportunity since the Industrial Revolution. It's changing your way of thinking about how we apply the wealth that we have.
Now, making that happen, in a way, does depend on political leadership. I think, you know, something that you've written about or made films about, that you've had lots to say about over the last 30 years. And in fact, possibly one of the most important, most famous political speeches of our lifetime was created by you. And I'm going to show our audience a clip of it going back to the days of Love Actually.
We may be a small country, but we're a great one too. Country of Shakespeare, Churchill, the Beatles, Sean Connery, Harry Potter. David Beckham's right foot. David Beckham's left foot, come to that. And a friend who bullies us is no longer a friend. And since bullies only respond to strength, from now onward, I will be prepared to be much stronger. And the president should be prepared for that.
It's 20 years since we saw that speech, and since then we've had Donald Trump, Brexit, US-led military action in Libya and Syria, the special relationship coming into question. Do you think what you wrote then is still relevant today?
Do you know, it's more important than it was then. I think that is the point. I mean, I think of ourselves as being in a climate war. I'm worried by the gentleness of the words climate warming when it's climate boiling, climate firing, you know, climate melting, all of these things. So, you know, it's always a question of determination to take things from where we are now. I think, you know, these are harder times, but they're times also with greater potential. You know, I think since then, $1 trillion, you know, has been invested in renewable energy. The world is changing. We've got AI. There are so many ways that we can exploit the situation that we're in. Certainly, at half-time, the thing that was never any use to say that was tough, I think we're going to lose. You know, there are so many, and I meet people all the time who are doing extraordinary work to try and improve their own communities and try and help people both at home and overseas. My personal experience is of a passionate younger generation committed to equality of gender, committed to equality of race, committed to the climate fight. You know, and what we're trying to say to that generation and politicians wanting the votes of that generation is let's, you know, screw ourselves to the sticking post and actually work harder, try harder, use all the new tools that we've got in our armory. I've always been an optimist, and I'm an optimist because I see so many people doing so many extraordinary things.
That speech and what you've just said are all really about political inspiration and political leadership. Do you think that the political leadership that we have on both sides of the Atlantic is really up to the demand that's being made by this new generation?
Well, look, I think there are extraordinary things that that Biden is doing. And I've always believed there are great politicians and people of goodwill, you know, in the UK. And the thing about, you know, what you're saying to the public is if you engage with it, politicians will engage with it more. I've never, ever experienced a politician who hasn't said if we hear it from the public, we're much more likely to do it. So I think we have to, you know, be hopeful and be determined. And as it were, as our little film says, what are you going to do? We've got to try and do things like, as it were, the making of this film, which will, with any luck, make a difference.
OK, when you come to make your next movie about political leadership, and we have a British political elite, who would you be casting as Mr. Keir Starmer now?
You know, the strange thing is Keir Starmer was apparently the inspiration for Colin Firth's part as a human, for Colin Firth's role in Bridget Jones. So I'm going to go for Colin, although I think he'll have to put on a little bit of weight.
What advice are you offering to Keir Starmer? It looked like he could conceivably be our next Prime Minister.
Well, look, I would, you know, say to Keir Starmer that I think he should pay a lot of attention to the SDGs and, you know, fulfil all the promises that are being made about Britain becoming a great, new, expanding green economy. You know, I think this is terrifically important, the urgency of all these issues.
This new short film is, again, about inspiration and leadership, and I just wondered what you made of what we've got now in the terms of leadership. I'm not really asking you about left or right.
I think that, you know, cometh the hour, cometh the man. And, you know, I think that when you're faced with reality of political power, it's very interesting how you use it. And I'm just saying in this film, every leader, rethink your determination, rethink the urgency of the moment, look at what's happening on climate, look at what's happening on poverty, and, you know, be as imaginative and determined. And I think the key thing is this idea that every leader has two jobs in their own country and globally, because, as it were, no country is an island, and it's absolutely important that Britain, which has always been the greatest country in terms of the foundation of organisations like Save the Children, of Oxfam, in all the leadership that they've showed in, you know, Live Aid, all of those things, that Britain should, as it were, reclaim its natural position as one of the people who try and change the world for the better.
Richard Curtis, keep doing what you're doing. Thank you very much indeed.
बम्बई शहर सरकार के हाथ से निकल के हाजी और पठान के हाथ में जा रहा था।
ईमानदारी का करोगे क्या इस्माइल?
नींद अच्छी आती है। शहर साफ करते करते मेरा घर गंदा हो गया।
पुलिस वाले के घर में चोर पैदा हुआ है।
मैं ईमानदार था, पर दारा भूखा था।
आज से हफ्ता हम लोग वसूलेगा।
Well, it's a show called Bombay My Beloved, Bombay Meri Jaan in Hindi. And it's set in the early 70s. It talks about organized crime syndicates. But at the heart of it, it's a story of this one family where the father is in law enforcement and the son chooses a completely different path, which is a path of crime, and the impact that it has on the family, on the relationship, and just those dynamics. So it's a very, I mean, of course, there is brutality in it because it's a brutal world that they all live in. But at the heart of it, it really is it's a family drama of father and son. You know, a human side to a story. I mean, even someone who goes into a life of crime did what he or she did. So we wanted to like kind of explore that morality, explore that dark side of the human psyche, the side of a person that just for survival can make choices that probably you and I would not make. You know, so it touches upon all these things as well. So I've been engaged in speaking to young boys and young men since about 2012. So it's over 10 years now, and I really did feel that there was a lot of work being done in India addressing women's issues, empowering women, dealing with survivors of violence. But there was very little going on, in my understanding, of who was engaging with young boys and young men to educate them or to sensitize them towards the role that they need to play in helping create a more equitable society. So that's really how I started with a place called MARD, which is Men Against Rape and Discrimination. And with the work that I was doing on that, that's when UN reached out to me and said if we could kind of just get together to amplify each other's message. I've grown up in a family where I was predominantly with my mother and my sister. I've seen their struggles. I've seen what they can achieve. So there's no reason why women should not have the same opportunities that men have.
Welcome back. This is Sunday Morning with Trevor Phillips. Let's go back to our panel now. Good Harry, Aisha Hazarika and Daisy McAndrew are still here. I want to take you back to something we talked about earlier on. My esteemed colleague Sam Coates, who understands politics way better than, frankly, all of us, is saying that he thinks that what Keir Starmer said, which is that Labour will not under any circumstances be part of a European or EU quota scheme, is significant news. Aisha, correct?
I do agree with that, actually, because I think a line of attack that opened up, because there was a bit of confusion when the initial announcement was made, a big line of attack that you've seen coming from the Conservative Party, and I've also heard it from voters, the red wall voters that Keir Starmer is trying to bring back. There has been an anxiety that somehow this is a plan to get back into the EU through the back door. So I think what your interview did, and I think what's important about that moment, is that's a moment for Keir Starmer to clarify, no, we are not going back into the EU by the back door. We're not signing up to the EU quota scheme. Now, that may upset many Remainers, who are saying, well, hang on, he'll probably get a lot of criticism now saying he's made a mistake saying that we should be. But I think that is an important kind of line in the sand.
Guto, the way you saw it?
Trying to have his cake and eat it, to borrow a phrase about someone else, in that he's trying to say we will talk to the Europeans and we will end up with something more constructive than these nasty Tories have, and yet he's ruling out the very thing that would be on the table. So it's a bit like the rhetoric on terrorism without the reality.
All right, let's spend the rest of the time we have talking about what is obviously the big story of the day. Richard Curtis gives comedy a good name. By the way, he told me off screen, big revelation, he and Emma Freud, his partner of 32 years, just got married.
Oh.
You heard it here first. But not everybody in comedy does that. And we heard from James Cleverly, I think, an interesting response to the point that both in media and politics, we are seeing the emergence of these scandals. Aisha, you've been actually in both areas. You've been in comedy and you've also been in politics. Do you agree with him that there's a connection?
I think a lot of this is about abuse of power and also how stars are treated, whether they're political stars, whether they're stars in entertainment. But what we're seeing is this repeat behaviour where somebody was hiding in plain sight. Now, I was on the comedy circuit around the same time as Russell Brand. I gigged with Russell Brand. I went on a number of his shows. And it was an open secret in the world of comedy for a long time that his behaviour made a lot of women feel deeply, deeply uncomfortable. Lots of female comedians, talked about this behind the scenes, but they didn't feel they had the power to do anything about it. Now, we see that story time and time over again, whether it's researchers in Parliament, whether it's young producers in, TV broadcasting places. And we have to have a situation where we believe people. We have a culture where if people come forward, they will be taken seriously. Some people are going, and there's a backlash already against these women on Twitter. You see lots of people going, well, why didn't these women come forward? The percentage of cases in terms of rapes that ever get prosecuted is around 1%. So we have a long way to go. But I think for a lot of people, this story has been, and of course, he denies all of this. It's really important to say. But for a lot of people, they feel very upset about this because, there has been a lot of rumours.
But there are two issues at play here. There is the sort of Me Too aspect and the rape allegations, very, very serious allegations about his behaviour. But almost more important politically is the fact that he has built himself up as an anti-establishment, messianic figure with millions and millions of followers who are already shouting and screaming that this is mainstream media trying to take down their man. He's using a lot of sort of Trumpian tactics. This is a witch hunt. They're trying to, it's tall poppy syndrome. They're trying to cut me down. They're making up these stories because I am providing something that mainstream media is not providing. And I know people who are very cultish about Russell Brand, who adore him with a passion. And I think it's going to get very, very nasty. And you're going to see, as in so many political issues, a very divisive story with two camps shouting at each other.
Well, look, that's it for this week. Next week, the King of the North, Andy Burnham, Manchester Mayor, and we need to talk about Kevin, author Lionel Shriver. Thank you for spending so much of your Sunday morning with us. Hope to see you again next Sunday at 8:30 a.m. Goodbye.